Hey there, so just before we jump into the video, I just want to say I got a new website quite recently. I finished working on it, I'm very proud of it. So I'd really appreciate it if you guys go down there and have a look. It's got all my stuff about what I do as a commissioned painter and some other services that I offer. And I'd love it if you guys have a look, tell me what you think, get back to me with any feedback. That'd be really appreciated. So thanks very much. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into the video. Hello and welcome to JJ Painting. I am JJ and welcome to Age of Sigmarch. As you can probably guess, this is going to be an entire month dedicated to Age of Sigmar, so it's going to be all Age of Sigmar all month for the month of March. And as you can tell from the title of this video, we're going to start off talking about the accessibility of Age of Sigmar. Is it more accessible than 40k? And is it more accessible than fantasy that came before it? We've had about 6 years now to get to know Age of Sigmar and get a good sense of how things are going to look from now on, but also a good sense of how easy or how difficult it is to get into the game. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. And as ever, always, we're going to be painting this model right here. Yes, it's a classic Chaos Knight. And a little thing about this month. So one of the other reasons I wanted to do this is because I have a unit of Chaos Knights and a converted chariot that I acquired a few years ago. And I thought this would be a good opportunity to, paint them up and finish them off, do that thing, the guilty gamers thing of trying to actually finish one of his armies or one of his units just once, at least once in his lifetime. So this is what we're painting, so you're going to be seeing a lot of Chaos Knights this month and eventually that converted chariot. More about that in a bit, I think, as well. So anyway, without further ado, let's crack on! So, when we think about Age of Sigmar and 40k, it's very easy to slip back into the old way of thinking of Warhammer Fantasy Battles and 40k. Now, Warhammer Fantasy Battles, by the end, did have a very high buy-in cost and had a very high maintenance and somewhat overcomplicated rule system. And for those of us who do remember that system, it's very easy to keep having overlaps between that system and Age of Sigmar and everything that comes with it. But we need to bear in mind that that's no longer the case. Sigmar is a different game with a very different core set of rules and a very different approach in terms of what it's setting out to do and the kind of game that you're meant to play with it. So all of this to say, in our first point, is that Age of Sigmar's accessibility and its point of entry is not the same as Fantasy's was back in the day. Now, it should be mentioned nice and early that obviously Age of Sigmar does have a very similar buy-in cost in the grand scheme of things to 40k, but that's only particularly valid if you're looking at it from the same start point. The main way to get into 40k has always very much been armies, and smaller games such as Kill Team and Combat Patrol very much fall into a latter category. That's something you don't necessarily start with, or if you do start with it, it's something you don't stick with. Most 40k players going back throughout the years have largely been aiming at games of 1500 to 2000 and even 3000 points nowadays, but Age of Sigmar doesn't follow that same trend. However, if we do look at the similar buy-in points to get to those army prices, yes, they do have a very similar buy-in cost. If you want an Age of Sigmar army or if you want a 40k army, overall those costs are going to be very much the same if you're looking at it from a purely matched play points perspective. So in that respect, the accessibility of Age of Sigmar is no different to 40k. But now we need to talk about the ways they are different. And the first thing is to say is that whilst 40k's emphasis largely has been on larger armies, Age of Sigmar doesn't have the same emphasis on larger armies, which immediately makes it a little bit easier to approach. When we look at the smaller systems such as Warcry, Diachasm, and the other smaller boxed games, Age of Sigmar has far more of those, far more skirmish, far more character-based, far more small scale that are easier to get into and to start playing quickly. 40k has somewhat had that over the years with things such as Lost Patrol and Space Hulk, but both of those were very much far-flung games with their own rules that didn't tie that well into 40k. But the other thing to remember is that when we then talk about things like Kill Team has never had any specialist teams dedicated to its system the same way Age of Sigmar has some dedicated warbands and kill teams, for want of a better word, in Warcry. And that's an important thing to bear in mind as we go forward. There are things that differentiate Warcry and Age of Sigmar as games, both in rules-wise, but also cosmetically. It's nice that all the models in Warcry also have rules in Age of Sigmar, and most of the models in Age of Sigmar have rules in Warcry, and vice versa if you can get the kill team. But to have that starting point where you can say this distinctively is going to be at its best in Age of Sigmar, and this is going to be at its best in Warcry, does give a better point of entry to everyone and gives more options. Whereas in 40k, because they don't have that, everything is immediately looking at being either in a 40k army and therefore in one of the codexes somewhere. And that's something which we need to bear in mind, which is why Age of Sigmar definitely has a difference when you're approaching it because of this aesthetic. This brings me on to my next point, is that when we talk about Age of Sigmar and 40k, the lore of Age of Sigmar is very recent in the grand scheme of things. Now, Age of Sigmar's been around for about 6 years at time of recording, which is a fair bit of time, but in those 6 years, the lore has remained quite streamlined and quite straightforward. We've seen how we've gone from the world that was in fantasy into the mortal realms, the Realm Gate Wars, the Soul Wars, the Broken Realms. The story continues to evolve as time goes by, but it evolves in a far more narrative-based way than 40k has done, which has very much started in one place and very much remained there this entire time. And so this gives a better sense of flow to where the game is. Whilst Age of Sigmar from a gameplay perspective may largely stay the same, with the exception of tweaks to the rules and new battle tomes, it means that the emphasis isn't on new additions. The emphasis is on the next step forward in the story, making the whole thing more narrative-based than 40k. And in terms of accessibility, this does mean that people have a much firmer understanding as to where they are in the narrative when they arrive. For example, when the Soul Wars was released, yes, it was the first big step forward after the original Age of Sigmar copy, and things did change rules-wise, and a lot of things changed gameplay-wise. But also the narrative moved forward. Nagash came back. We saw the advent of the Nighthaunt. Broken Realms has seen more things that have changed. We're starting to see more of the factions within the Grand Alliances come into their own and develop into their own stories, develop their own characters, and start to stand up on their feet, both within the ensemble of the Grand Alliance, but also on their own, which gives them a greater appeal. But to carry on this point on the lore, this is something I think we should dwell on for a moment, because when we look at 40k has very much the 1 minute to midnight thing. We've just had the Third War for Armageddon, we've just had the 13th Black Crusade, we've just had all these things that are happening or have just happened, but there's no sense of progression. If you were playing 40k in 2002, your story is the exact same as it is in 2012, 2015, etc. There has been a slight moving forward from the Gathering Storm at the end of 7th edition, which brought back Roboti Guilliman, which gave us the Crux Maledictum, which split the Imperium in half. These, and obviously the advent of the Primaris, and these are all nice steps forward. But the trouble is that from a narrative perspective and how it affects the game, they're not as tangible as they are in Age of Sigmar, where everything feels like there's a bigger step forward. Psychic Awakening arguably was meant to be that step forward, but it never really manifested quite the way we wanted it to, and it very much felt more like a proof of concept for a lot of the things that we're going to start seeing in the codexes in 9th edition, thereby making it more significant to gameplay than to narrative. But the other thing to bear in mind at this point is that Age of Sigmar, lore-wise, doesn't have the same rabbit hole that Space Marines do. Every faction has a certain amount of history and backstory, a lot of them originating from the point that this new world was created, the new world of the mortal realms. However, in 40k, most factions simply don't have that. There is the very well documented rabbit hole of history that is the Imperium, especially when it comes to things like the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. Considering those things are book series unto themselves, you can see very quickly and have a very good sense of where the plotted history was. But for the other factions, such as Necrons, Eldar, Tyranids, and even Orcs, it's very hard to get that same sense of history, that same sense of where all those races are. And this is an important thing when we talk about perspectives. 40k has always very much been from the perspective of humanity, almost exclusively so. Whereas Age of Sigmar and even fantasy before it had a far more ensemble-based look at things. You could change your perspective. You could look at things from the perspective of the dwarves, or the orcs, or the ogres, or even the chaos tribes. But you were never fixed to one perspective, and therefore you got a far more well-rounded look at all the factions, everyone in it, and where they all were. Now, and also, as a side note, this brings me on to my next point of accessibility, both from a lore and somewhat from a gameplay perspective. Thanks to things like the Total War games, which are all relatively recent, they give a sense of tangible history to Age of Sigmar. It's almost like a prequel for people who weren't playing fantasy. It gives you a sense of what it was like before the world of Age of Sigmar in a far more interactive and in some respects far more interesting way, which means you don't have to go back and read many, many books. Don't get me wrong, the Warhammer Chronicle novels, as they are now known, are very good, and there's some fantastic titles in there. I'd always recommend the Gotrix and Felix and the Malice Darkblade series as being my favourite ones. But when we then think about that in terms of 40k, we don't really have that. We have the Horus Heresy novels, which have in many ways been overshadowing the 40k novels for the past decade or so. So much so, in fact, that people have argued that the Primaris, the Return of Guilliman, and a lot of the things that have come out of that are very much the result of those novels being so much more popular than the narrative in 40k as it stands. But that's a bit of a side note, but it's worth mentioning while we're here. So, to relate that back in terms of accessibility, yes, the lore of Age of Sigmar is more accessible because it is more narrative-based and it's a moving narrative, whereas 40k's lore is very much a fixed perspective from one race at one time that hasn't moved for many years, whilst a much more interesting narrative in some respect happened in its backstory, and the backstory in the Horus Heresy has unfortunately become slightly more interesting than the actual current setting. So this brings me on to my next point, and this is when we get back to those factions I was talking about. Because 40k, everything is seen very much from the perspective of humanity, it does mean that even the most interesting and well-rounded of the Xenos races do still feel a little bit anemic and lacking in detail. But also at the same time, it's quite hard to know where to place everything. Age of Sigmar's 4 Grand Alliances does give a far greater sense of order to all the factions. So obviously you have the faction of Order, which does comprise the majority of the races, both new and old. You have the Death faction, which comprises the majority of the undead, which includes things like vampire counts from Warhammer Fantasies. Then of course you've got Destruction, which is largely the orcs, goblins, trolls, ogres and giants. And then Chaos, which is just chaos. And incidentally, it's quite funny to think that the Chaos Grand Alliance has actually been one of the big winners going from Fantasy to Age of Sigmar. There are now more battle tomes in Age of Sigmar for Chaos than there ever were army books in Fantasy. There's been far more work done to make each of the different god-specific armies more distinct, and the fact that they've given each one of them their own book does say quite a lot. It has had a lot of people who play Chaos in 40k wishing for something like that, but that's a video for another time. But if you are a new player going into Age of Sigmar, it's very easy to know that you're starting from one of 4 points and then you can branch off from there, which does mean that the stepping stones are a lot more straightforward and a lot easier to understand than if you're coming at it from a different perspective. And then, of course, this leads me on to my last point, which I think is a really important one, both from a gameplay perspective, and this is useful for everyone. Age of Sigmar does unquestionably have more free resources online. And that's a really important thing at this stage to bear in mind. Age of Sigmar has the War Scroll Builder on the Warhammer community website where you can build your pointed army lists. Every data scroll for every unit in Age of Sigmar is available online to download and to read. So you can get a very well-rounded look at virtually what every unit can do. Yes, you do need the battle tomes to get the army special rules and to get things such as command traits and relics and understand the different sub-factions within each one, that's true. But the fact that you can get a really good sense of what a unit does on the battlefield and then figure out roughly how that correlates when you've got a large number of battle scrolls in front of you, it makes it easier to start building a sense of what each army is when you're a new player. Even if you've only had a couple of games to introduce you to the system, you know what everything is, what everyone does, and how they will do it. And that's a really helpful thing, which unfortunately 40k doesn't have. And then, of course, there are the apps. I won't get into the talk about the 2 apps, but to be honest with you, if we're looking at the app side by side, the Age of Sigmar app is still free, and it does have the War Scrolls, and it has the points on the War Scrolls as well. So again, it is a free resource that you have access to if you want to play. So to conclude, is Age of Sigmar more accessible than 40k? I would lean towards yes, Sigmar is more accessible. There's more free resources online. The entry point is much easier to understand. The cost of entering at a certain level is much lower, and there's no pressure to go up to the next levels unless you want to. The game system works at every level, and even if you don't necessarily want to move up, there are interesting ways to play at each level without having to overspend or overexpand your armies beyond what you can comfortably afford or what you may necessarily want to have. One of the big things that is actually quite interesting and doesn't get spoken about a lot is there are people out there who don't want to have massive sprawling armies all over the tabletop. That's actually something we don't talk about a huge amount. There are people who just want their kill team size or their warband size battle force and that's it. Maybe a slightly larger army, but at the same time, they don't want hundreds of models. That's actually something which we don't necessarily acknowledge, and it's important that we do. Not everyone wants to have an all-infantry guard army. But as always, I leave this to you. Do you think Age of Sigmar is more accessible than 40k, or do you think it's the other way around? Do you think Age of Sigmar's buy-in price is maybe even higher than 40k's on some levels? Do you think that Age of Sigmar's free resources are actually a good way to get people more invested, or do you think it comes at the detriment of actually being able to fully understand it without the army books? Let me know your thoughts. I look forward to hearing from you. So, there we have it, my thoughts and opinions on the accessibility of Age of Sigmar versus 40k, and to an extent, Fantasy that came before it. Like I said before, let me know what your thoughts are in the comments, and while you're down there, like, subscribe, all that good YouTube shilly stuff. I will be continuing to my current schedule of releasing videos every Wednesday and Friday for the foreseeable future, and our Chaos Night will be coming up in a minute or so. But thank you all very much for watching, goodbye, and have a lovely day.